Mr. Whitmore is asking that irrelevant community comments be kept under 2 minutes. The clerk said into the microphone, and the room answered with the kind of silence that only money could buy. Naomi Carter sat in the third row with a manila folder balanced on her knees, its corners softened by use, the paper inside marked with tabs, notes, and the careful underlines of someone who had read every line because she could not afford not to. The city hearing room on the 22nd floor felt colder than it should have, all polished wood, glass walls, and recessed lighting that washed every face into the same pale shade of official indifference. Beyond the windows, downtown Atlanta shimmered in late afternoon haze, but inside, the air smelled faintly of printer toner, burnt coffee, and rain drying on expensive coats. At the front of the room, Richard Whitmore sat with one ankle resting over his knee, a navy suit fitted so precisely it seemed to hold his posture in place, his silver watch glinting each time he moved his hand. He did not look at the residents filling the back rows. He looked at the board members, the attorneys, the assistants sliding binders across the table, the people trained to nod before he finished speaking. On the screen behind him, the words Rivergate Renewal Initiative glowed in clean blue letters above a rendering of glass towers, landscaped walkways, and smiling stock photo families who looked like they had never worried about rent a day in their lives. Naomi had walked 6 blocks from the bus stop in low heels that pinched by the second block and blistered by the fourth, carrying a folder filled with eviction projections, environmental reports, and a list of names from her neighborhood written in her own hand. Ms. Eloise Turner in Unit 3B, 72, oxygen tank. Darren and Felicia Holmes, 3 children, 1 on dialysis. Mr. Alvarez, veteran, fixed income. She had promised each of them she would speak. Not shout, not beg, not make a scene. Just speak clearly enough that somebody, somewhere on that polished dais, would have to hear what this project would actually do once the cameras were gone and the press release had been sent out. Her turn came 43 minutes into the hearing, after a consultant in horn-rimmed glasses praised revitalization corridors, after a lawyer called displacement concerns statistically overstated, after. Whitmore himself smiled with all the warmth of a locked bank vault, and said his company was investing in people, not just property. Naomi rose when the clerk called her name. Her blouse was simple, cream-colored, with sleeves buttoned at the wrist. Her shoes were worn. Her spine was straight. She carried her folder to the microphone with both hands, as if what she held mattered enough to deserve steadiness. For 1 second, she could feel every eye in the room slide toward her, then past her, then back again, registering the details people always registered first. Black woman. No entourage. No title after the name. Not from their side of town. She adjusted the microphone slightly and unfolded one sheet. Good afternoon, she began, her voice low but clear. My name is Naomi Carter, and I'm here on behalf of residents who were never consulted before this. Let's keep this relevant, Richard Whitmore said without raising his voice. He did not look at her when he interrupted. He looked at the chair of the board, as though the correction did not need to touch Naomi directly to land where he wanted it to. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone near the wall coughed into a fist. Naomi's fingers tightened on the page, but she did not step back. It is relevant, she said. Your redevelopment plan relies on occupancy assumptions that leave out long-term leaseholders, and the traffic study. Whitmore leaned toward his attorney, then toward the microphone at his table. Mr. Chairman, if we're opening the floor to uninformed accusations, we'll be here all night. A thin ripple of restrained laughter moved through one corner of the room and died almost as quickly as it started. Naomi heard it anyway. She felt it the way people feel cold through an old apartment window, not dramatic, not sharp, just familiar enough to make the body brace before the mind does. The board chairman glanced down at the agenda, then at Whitmore, then finally at Naomi with the apologetic expression of a man about to choose comfort over courage. Ms. Carter, he said, please limit your remarks to new information. Naomi lifted the report in her hand. This is new information. Section 4 of the Environmental Review omits the floodplain impact on the South Block, and if you move forward without, this time Whitmore looked at her. It was brief, almost casual, the way a person might glance at a buzzing sound before asking someone else to handle it. She doesn't get the floor to lecture this board, he said. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. They crossed the room with polished certainty and settled over everything. The clerk froze with his pen hovering above the minutes. A woman in the second row lowered her phone. One of Whitmore's junior associates stared very hard at his legal pad, as if eye contact itself had become dangerous. Naomi stood there with the microphone inches from her mouth, and the whole room quietly rearranged itself around the fact that a powerful man had decided her voice was optional. For a second, all she could hear was the hum of the overhead vents and the thin electrical buzz from the projector. She became aware of absurd details: the small fray at the edge of her folder, the ache in her left heel, the reflection of fluorescent light in the polished lip of the dais. Her throat felt dry, but her face stayed still. "The people in those buildings deserve to be heard," she said, and her voice, if anything, came out steadier now. Whitmore's expression did not change. "And I'm sure they'll find the proper channel," he said. "This hearing is for serious submissions." Naomi looked at him then, fully, taking in the immaculate suit, the cufflinks, the easy posture of a man who had never once mistaken being obeyed for being right. In that instant she understood something that would stay with her for years. He was not just dismissing her facts. He was dismissing the possibility that someone like her could ever stand in a room like this and force someone like him to listen. The chairman cleared his throat. "Next speaker," he said softly. Naomi did not move right away. Her notes trembled once between her fingers, then stilled. Around her, the room exhaled with relief. Already eager to return to its language of grants and parcels and tax incentives, to the safe machinery of decisions made over people rather than with them. But Naomi stayed standing long enough to gather every face, every silence, every polished surface into memory, as if some quieter part of her already knew this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. When the heavy door closed behind her, the sound was softer than Naomi expected. Not a slam, not a public rejection loud enough for anyone to feel guilty about later, just a clean mechanical click that left her standing alone in the hallway with her folder pressed against her ribs and the taste of stale air in the back of her throat. The corridor outside the hearing room was lined with framed photographs of ribbon cuttings and campaign smiles, all bright teeth and handshakes under gold plaques, proof that the building liked to remember power only at its most polished. A maintenance worker pushed a gray cart past the elevators, the scent of lemon disinfectant trailing behind him, and for one strange second that smell nearly undid her more than the humiliation had. It was too ordinary, too steady, too indifferent to what had just happened in the room behind her. Naomi walked to the tall window at the end of the hall and set her folder on the ledge. Down below, traffic crawled through wet streets, brake lights glowing red in the early evening drizzle. Tiny people hurried along the sidewalks with umbrellas tilting against the wind, each of them moving like their lives mattered completely to them and not at all to anyone on the 22nd floor. She let out a breath she had been holding for so long it made her chest ache. Her hands were trembling now, not visibly enough for a stranger to notice, but enough that the tabs inside the folder shivered against each other with a dry paper whisper. She flattened her palms on the cold stone ledge and stared at her own reflection in the glass. The overhead lighting made her look more tired than she had felt that morning. There were faint shadows under her eyes. A loose strand of hair had slipped near her cheek. Her face was calm in that reflection, almost too calm, as if her body had decided stillness was the only dignity no one in that room could vote away. She replayed the moment anyway, because that is what humiliation does when it is fresh. It does not leave all at once. It circles back and asks whether you heard it correctly, whether everyone else heard it the way you did, whether maybe you were foolish to think facts would matter once they came from your mouth. She heard him. Again without meaning to. She does not get the floor. Not you are incorrect. Not show us the numbers. Not this report is flawed. Just that. As if the problem was not what she knew, but who she was while knowing it. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, and behind her eyelids she saw Ms. Turner's oxygen tube looped over one ear, saw little Isaiah Holmes asleep on a sofa, while his mother tried to read a rent increase notice she did not fully understand, saw floodwater from 3 summers ago, sitting brown and silent at curb level, because the South Block always took the hit first, and the official maps never seemed to say so. Those people were still real, no matter what had happened in that room. Their leases were still fragile. Their buildings were still marked for demolition. Their names were still written in blue ink inside the folder on the stone ledge. Naomi opened the folder and looked at the top page again, not because she needed to, but because it anchored her. Parcel numbers, dates, signatures, footnotes. The facts had not changed just because a billionaire had smiled while cutting her off. A young intern stepped out of the hearing room carrying a stack of binders and nearly stopped when he saw her. He could not have been older than 22. His tie was crooked, and his badge was clipped on backward. For a second, he looked like he wanted to say something. Maybe sorry. Maybe you were right. Maybe nothing useful at all. But then he lowered his eyes and kept walking. Naomi watched him go and felt something settle inside her. Not relief, not forgiveness, something quieter and harder. The room had not only silenced her. It had trained everyone in it to mistake silence for professionalism, to call cowardice order, to call exclusion efficiency, to call contempt relevance. Rain streaked the window in thin, crooked lines, bending the city lights. Naomi reached into her bag for a pen and, on the inside cover of the folder, wrote the date in small, careful letters. Then beneath it she wrote one sentence. They can close the microphone, but they cannot close the truth. She looked at the words until they stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling necessary. Behind her, the elevator bell chimed. Laughter drifted faintly from the hearing room, followed by the scrape of chairs and the low murmur of people who would soon head to garages, restaurants, and condos where this had already become just another successful meeting. Naomi picked up the folder, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the elevator with the same measured pace she had used on the way in. By the time the doors opened, the shaking in her hands was gone. In its place was something colder, cleaner, and far more durable than anger. She had come hoping they would let her speak. She left understanding that one day she would have to stand in a room where no one could take that right from her. By the time Naomi reached the bus stop, the rain had turned from a mist into the kind of steady spring drizzle that soaked through a blazer without ever looking dramatic. Water gathered along the curb in shallow ripples, catching the yellow reflection of the traffic lights, and the wind kept lifting the damp edge of the hearing agenda still folded in her bag like it wanted to remind her where she had just been. She stood under the narrow shelter with 3 strangers and watched downtown empty itself into the evening. Men in pressed shirts loosened their ties as they hurried toward parking garages. Women in heels stepped carefully around puddles while talking into phones about dinner reservations and delayed flights. Nobody looked at Naomi for more than a second. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like another version of the same thing, as if the city had perfected 2 ways of erasing a person, first by humiliating her in public, and then by moving on as though she had never been there at all. When the bus finally came, its brakes sighed against the wet street, and the doors folded open with a tired mechanical wheeze. Naomi climbed aboard, dropped her fare into the slot, and took a seat halfway down beside a fogged window streaked with rain. The seat fabric smelled faintly of old detergent and damp wool. A toddler near the front was half asleep against his mother's shoulder. 2 teenagers in school hoodies shared earbuds and looked at something on a cracked phone screen, trying not to laugh too loud. The ordinary weight of everyone else's evening settled around Naomi in a way that made her own thoughts sharper. She took out the folder again, though the overhead bus light was weak and yellow, and the motion made the print blur each time they hit a pothole. She did not need to read the numbers to know them. She knew exactly how many units would be cleared in Phase 1. She knew how many families had month-to-month leases. She knew which section of the floodplain map had been omitted from the public summary. Facts sat in her mind with the hard, clean edges of things earned the slow way. What hurt was not that she had been wrong. What hurt was that being right had not been enough to make the room respect her voice for even 30 seconds. The bus rolled west, past courthouse steps slick with rain, past a pawn shop with a flickering sign, past a diner window glowing warm against the gray. Naomi leaned her head back and closed her eyes for one stop, then 2, letting the rumble beneath her feet carry her through the ache in her shoulders. She thought of her mother waiting at home in their apartment on Auburn Avenue, probably in the old armchair near the lamp with a cardigan over her knees no matter the season, because the medication always made her cold. Her mother would ask how it went in the simple, dangerous way only mothers can ask, not because they want a summary, but because they can hear truth trying to hide in the answer. Naomi pictured setting the folder on the kitchen table, heating Kent's soup, pretending she was more tired than upset. But even that image carried its own small shame, because she had told people she would speak for them, and then came back with nothing anyone could use except another story about a door closing. The bus turned near Old Fourth Ward, and she looked out at a stretch of brick buildings darkened by rain. Somewhere behind one row of them was the public library where she had spent half her Saturdays growing up, first at the children's tables, then in the stacks, then eventually in the legal reference section, where she learned there were whole languages built to sound neutral while deciding who got protected and who got priced out. She remembered being 15 and reading cases she barely understood, tracing the names of judges with her finger, struck by the strange quiet authority of the page. Those decisions had shape, weight, permanence. Nobody could wave them off with a smile and a microphone. At the next stop, an older man got on carrying a grocery bag with celery leaves sticking out of the top. He nodded at Naomi before taking the seat across from her. A few minutes later, when the bus lurched, the folder on her lap slipped sideways and one of the pages slid to the floor. The man bent, picked it up carefully, and handed it back without looking at the details. "You do not let the rain win," he said with a tired little smile, noticing the damp edge of the paper. It was an ordinary kindness, the kind that passes so quickly it should not matter, but it caught her off guard. "I am trying not to," Naomi said. He nodded once like that answer made perfect sense and turned to stare out the window again. Naomi held the paper in both hands and looked at the highlighted paragraphs, the footnotes, the signatures. Then she thought of the hearing room one more time, not with fresh hurt now, but with a clearer kind of anger. Richard Whitmore had spoken as if relevance were something he could grant or deny from the comfort of his chair, as if truth needed his permission to matter, as if the people living in drafty apartments and flood-prone blocks were background details in a story whose real subject was his ambition. Naomi stared at the blurred city sliding by outside and felt the shape of a decision begin to form, not sudden, not theatrical, but deep enough to change the direction of a life. She did not want another chance to plead from the back of a room. She wanted to understand the machinery well enough to stop being handled by it. She wanted the kind of authority that did not depend on whether powerful men found her convenient. By the time the bus sighed to her stop, she had not yet named the future out loud, but she could feel it waiting for her with the steady certainty of dawn. She stepped down into the damp evening, tightened her grip on the folder, and started walking home through the smell of wet concrete and blooming magnolia, carrying in silence the first real outline of the woman she would become. That night, the apartment seemed smaller than usual, as if the walls had drawn in half an inch on every side while Naomi was gone. The place sat on the third floor of a brick building with radiators that hissed in winter and windows that stuck every summer, but it was clean, warm, and arranged with the kind of care that comes from making a little feel like enough. A lamp with a beige shade cast soft light across the living room, touching the crocheted blanket folded over the arm of the sofa, the framed church program on the wall from Naomi's father's funeral years ago, the row of medicine bottles lined up neatly on the side table beside her mother's chair. On the stove, a pot of chicken soup was warming low, and the apartment carried the smell of broth, black pepper, and the faint medicinal sweetness of vapor rub. Her mother, Lorraine Carter, looked up from her chair the moment Naomi stepped in. Lorraine had always had the kind of face that revealed less than people expected, not cold, never that, just disciplined by years of stretching money, swallowing worry, and continuing anyway. Even now, with a blanket over her lap and a paperback turned face down beside her, her eyes caught details the way some people caught lies. She saw the damp hem of Naomi's slacks, the folder tucked too tightly under one arm, the careful neutral expression that had already taken too much effort to hold in place. "You ate?" Lorraine asked, because that was how she began when the truth needed a few seconds to enter the room on its own. Naomi set the folder on the kitchen table and hung her blazer over the back of a chair. "Not yet," she said. "I was going to heat up some soup." Lorraine nodded once. "Then do that first. Bad news always sounds louder on an empty stomach." Naomi almost smiled at that. She ladled soup into 2 bowls, even though her mother had already eaten, because sharing the ritual mattered more than efficiency. The spoons clicked softly against ceramic as they sat across from each other at the small table under the yellow light. Outside, rain tapped against the window unit in a thin, patient rhythm. For a minute all they did was eat. Naomi welcomed the ordinary motions of it, the warmth against her palms, the steam on her face, the small comfort of pepper and salt, and something still within her control. Lorraine folded her napkin and finally said, "So tell me what happened." Naomi stared at the swirl of broth in her bowl. She had rehearsed versions of this on the walk home. Cleaner versions, less humiliating versions. Versions where she said they cut the public comment period short, or there was not enough time, or the board was not receptive. But the apartment had a way of thinning out excuses. "He would not let me finish," she said. Lorraine did not ask who. She knew. Naomi went on, her voice level because letting it crack would make the memory feel too immediate again. She described the hearing room, the polished table, the renderings on the screen, the board members who could not quite meet her eyes once the interruption came. She repeated Richard Whitmore's words as closely as she could bear to repeat them. She even described the laughter, quiet and brief, but real enough to echo on the bus ride home. Lorraine listened without interrupting, one hand wrapped around her mug though the tea inside had long gone lukewarm. When Naomi finished, silence settled over the table, but it was not the sterile silence of the hearing room. This one held grief, anger, memory, and something sturdier beneath all three. Lorraine looked down at Naomi's folder, at the colored tabs, the legal pads filled margin to margin, the stack of reports worn soft at the edges. "Did your facts change because he disrespected you?" she asked. Naomi blinked. "No. Did those people stop needing help because a rich man got comfortable in public?" Naomi shook her head. "No." Lorraine leaned back slightly, the lamp catching the silver at her temples. "Then what happened today was not a verdict. It was a lesson." Naomi let out a breath and looked away toward the rain-dark window. "I know what the lesson was," she said quietly. "That people like him get to decide whose voice matters." Lorraine's expression shifted then, not into pity, which she had never offered cheaply, but into the firm kind of love that refused to let pain name itself too soon. "No," she said. "The lesson is that if they can decide it in one room, then you need to get into a room where they cannot." Naomi looked back at her. For a second the apartment seemed to go very still, the refrigerator hummed low in the background, the radiator clicking once in the wall, the rain holding at the glass. Lorraine reached across the table and laid her hand over Naomi's, warm and dry and steady. "Baby," she said, "you have been studying the edges of their rules since you were old enough to reach the library shelves. You think I did not notice? You think I did not see the casebooks, the note cards, the way you listen when people from downtown use polished words to hide ugly things?" Naomi swallowed. She had not told anyone, not fully, how often she had imagined another path, one that led beyond community meetings and volunteer advocacy and into the deeper architecture of the law itself. The dream had always felt too expensive, too impractical, too selfish to say out loud, while bills sat unopened in the drawer and her mother's prescriptions refilled every month with the precision of gravity. "Law school costs money," Naomi said, and even as she said it the sentence sounded smaller than what had started moving inside her. Lorraine gave a soft, knowing exhale. "So does staying where men like that expect you to remain." Naomi lowered her eyes to their hands, one older and lined, one younger and tense, resting together on the worn kitchen table. The sting of the day had not disappeared. It was still there, sharp in places, hot in others. But beneath it, for the first time since the hearing, something else was taking shape. Not fantasy, not revenge, direction. A path measured not in outrage but in years, in books, in exams, in nights that would ask more from her than comfort ever could. Lorraine squeezed her hand once and withdrew it. "Finish your soup," she said gently. "Then tomorrow you start figuring out what comes next." Naomi looked at the folder again, at the date she had written inside, at the sentence beneath it. "They can close the microphone, but they cannot close the truth." Under the lamp's warm circle of light, with rain breathing softly at the window and her mother's faith sitting across from her like something borrowed from a stronger century, Naomi understood that the future had just stopped being an idea. It had become an obligation. The next morning began before sunrise, with the apartment still wrapped in the thin blue quiet that exists just before the city remembers itself. Naomi sat at the kitchen table in a sweatshirt and wool socks, a yellow legal pad open in front of her, the steam from her coffee drifting into the cone of light beneath the hanging fixture. The clock above the refrigerator read 5:23. Somewhere down the hall, a neighbor's television murmured through the wall, low and indistinct, and outside the window a garbage truck groaned along the curb with the slow authority of routine. On the table beside Naomi were 3 neat stacks. Monthly bills held together with a binder clip, her mother's prescription receipts folded into a white envelope, and a spread of law school information she had printed years ago and never thrown away. The pages looked older than the rest of the room, edges curled, ink slightly faded, as if they had been waiting for permission. She ran her finger down columns of tuition numbers, application deadlines, evening programs, scholarship requirements, and admission statistics that felt less like facts than like locked doors described in very polite language. Even with part-time options, even with grants, even with every practical compromise the schools advertised in brochures full of smiling students and impossible balance, the cost still hit her chest like a physical thing. Not only money, time, attention, sleep, energy she was already spending twice over. Lorraine's medications alone changed month to month, depending on insurance mood and pharmacy error. The rent was due in 11 days. The nonprofit where Naomi worked paid enough to keep them standing, not enough to let them breathe. She wrote numbers anyway. Tuition, books, transportation, test fees, application fees, lost work hours. She wrote them all in a careful column, then wrote what she had in savings beneath it, and for a second the gap between the two looked so wide it might as well have been a river. Naomi set down her pen and pressed her thumb to the bridge of her nose. The old temptation arrived right on time, dressed in the reasonable voice it always used. Be realistic. Help people the ways you already can. Keep your job. Keep your mother comfortable. Do not turn one humiliating day into a lifelong financial mistake. She knew that voice. It wore concern like a church hat. It sounded responsible. It had kept a lot of dreams from ever becoming embarrassing. Naomi stared at the legal pad until the lines blurred, then lifted her eyes to the law school pages again. One program offered night classes for working adults. Another had a public service scholarship. A third highlighted graduates in housing law and civil litigation, smiling beside words like access and equity and community impact. She almost laughed at that. Brochures were always generous with the language of justice. The real thing, she was learning, charged interest. Lorraine shuffled into the kitchen a few minutes later in her robe and slippers, tying the belt as she moved. You are up with the milkman, she said, voice still rough with sleep. Naomi slid the bills into a pile, but left the law school pages where they were. Hiding them now would only make them heavier. Lorraine took one look at the table and nodded as if a conversation begun the night before had simply resumed in daylight. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and stood there with one hand resting lightly on the counter while the burner clicked to life. How bad? She asked. Naomi let out a dry breath. Bad enough that sane people would close the folder and go to work. Lorraine gave a soft hum. Sane people never built much that mattered. Naomi turned the legal pad toward herself and tapped the page with the end of her pen. I can apply. That is not the problem. The problem is paying for it, and still paying for this life at the same time. Lorraine did not answer right away. The kettle began its low pre-whistle murmur. Morning light gathered faintly at the window, silvering the glass above the sink. This life, Lorraine said at last, has asked enough from you already. Maybe it is time to ask something back. Naomi looked at her mother, at the robe washed thin at the cuffs, at the careful way she shifted her weight when her joints hurt more than she liked to admit. There it was again, that dangerous combination of love and permission. Naomi glanced down at the application checklist and suddenly remembered the hearing room in a sharper way than she had all night. Not the insult itself this time, but the confidence behind it. Richard Whitmore had interrupted her with the smooth certainty of a man who had never expected consequences from dismissing someone like her. He had not needed anger. Systems that trusted him had already done the work of making that anger unnecessary. Naomi reached for her pen and drew a line beneath the last number on the page. Then she wrote a new list below it. Register for the test. Request transcripts. Ask about fee waivers. Research evening programs. Find scholarship deadlines. The list did not solve anything. It simply gave shape to motion. But shape mattered. She felt it immediately, the difference between despair and a plan measured one line at a time. Lorraine carried her tea to the table and sat across from her, steam curling around her face. "You know," she said, wrapping both hands around the mug, "some people think power looks like the loudest person in the room. It does not. Sometimes power is just the person who did their homework when everybody else was busy underestimating them." Naomi smiled then, not because anything had become easy, but because the sentence landed somewhere deep and true. She looked at the worn printouts, the narrow kitchen, the bills waiting with their plain white threats, the dawn slowly lifting itself over the brick buildings outside. None of it looked cinematic. None of it looked like destiny. It looked like fluorescent grocery aisles, bus schedules, refill dates, and secondhand textbooks. It looked like sacrifice in shoes that pinched and sleep measured in fragments. And that was exactly why it felt real. Naomi folded the oldest brochure, slipped it into her folder, and wrote one more sentence beneath her checklist in firm block letters. "I will not ask for the floor again. I will earn a seat no one can take from me." Then she tore the page from the pad, slid it into the front pocket of her folder, and rose to get dressed for work, carrying with her the first full weight of a choice that no longer felt like hope. It felt like law. 3 months later, Naomi took the admission test in a downtown hotel ballroom that smelled like carpet cleaner, brewed coffee, and nerves. The room was too cold, the kind of cold meant to keep people alert, but that mostly made everyone look slightly uncomfortable in their own skin. Long black tables stretched in straight rows beneath chandeliers dimmed just enough to feel serious, and every chair held the same small arrangement of sharpened pencils, answer sheets, and bottled water lined up with military neatness. Naomi sat near the back in a charcoal sweater and the least worn pair of flats she owned, her admission ticket tucked beside her identification, her hands folded once, then unfolded, then folded again in her lap. Around her, test takers moved with different kinds of confidence. Some flipped through prep books one last time with highlighted pages bristling from the sides. Some whispered to each other about logic games and timing strategies, their voices low and quick. One young man in a university sweatshirt bounced his knee hard enough to shake the table. A woman in pearls closed her eyes as though already practicing the expression of someone who expected to do well. Naomi had studied at the kitchen table after work, on bus rides, in waiting rooms, and once during her lunch break behind the non-profit office beside a dumpster that rattled every time the restaurant next door threw out boxes. She had taken practice sections with a timer propped against a sugar jar, memorized vocabulary by writing words on index cards, and learned to ignore the ache in her shoulders from carrying too much for too long. Even so, when the proctor began reading instructions in a clipped voice that flattened every sentence into procedure, Naomi felt the old pressure gathering at the base of her throat. It was not fear of the questions themselves. It was the deeper fear that she had arrived at one more room, built to measure whether she belonged inside it. She looked down at her pencil, then at the test booklet when it was placed before her, thick and sealed and silent. For one quick second, without warning, she saw the hearing room again, the polished dais, the bright screen, Richard Whitmore's calm interruption floating across the air as though he had every right in the world to decide whose knowledge counted. She could still hear the low laughter that followed. The memory landed hard, but not the way it had the first week. Back then it had made her feel small. Now it did something else. It sharpened her. The proctor said, "You may begin," and Naomi broke the seal. The first section was logic, all conditional statements and careful traps dressed up as certainty. Naomi breathed once, slow and even, then started. If all counsel. Members who accept private meetings are compromised, and some developers prefer compromised council members, which conclusion must be true. Her pencil moved steadily across the page. Not fast, not theatrical, just with the quiet discipline of someone who had spent years learning how to think under pressure while the bus rattled, while medication alarms sounded, while bills waited in stacks on the table. Midway through the second section, a cough started somewhere near the front and would not quit. A chair scraped. Someone dropped a pencil. Rain tapped against the ballroom windows in a soft, irregular pattern. Naomi kept going. She was not the fastest in the room, and she knew it. But speed had never been the center of her strength. Her strength was endurance. Her strength was not giving panic the dignity of control. During the short break, she stood by the coffee station with a paper cup of water and stretched the fingers of her writing hand. 2 men nearby were comparing undergraduate majors, and debating which prep company had the better instructors. One of them glanced at Naomi's discount store watch, then at the bus pass peeking from the edge of her wallet, and returned to his conversation with the practiced indifference of someone who did not consider exclusion rude if it arrived in silence. Naomi did not shrink from it. She had started recognizing that expression in all its forms. It showed up in hearing rooms, internships, interviews, scholarship panels, and lobbies with marble floors. It was never exactly the same, but it always carried the same assumption underneath, that some people came from the natural center of a room and others entered it as a question. When the final section ended, the proctor called time, and a collective exhale moved through the ballroom like wind through blinds. Naomi set down her pencil and flexed her cramped hand. Outside, the rain had stopped. Thin sunlight spread across the wet pavement beyond the glass doors, turning the parking lot into a sheet of broken silver. She gathered her things slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because the moment deserved to be felt in full. She had no score yet, no scholarship, no acceptance letter. She had only a used pencil, a sore wrist, and the knowledge that she had shown up to a gate designed to intimidate people and pushed against it anyway. On her way out, she passed a mirror near the hotel lobby and caught her reflection for half a step. Tired eyes, good posture, a woman carrying a cheap tote bag and a future that still looked expensive. She kept walking. By the time the revolving doors eased her out onto the damp sidewalk, the city air felt warmer than it had that morning. Naomi stood for a second under the hotel awning, listening to water drip from the edge of the roof, and felt something settle in her chest with quiet certainty. Whatever number would eventually arrive in the mail, whatever rejection or opportunity followed, she had already crossed a line that mattered. She was no longer only defending people from the outside of power. She was on her way in. 2 weeks later, the envelope arrived in a plain white sleeve with the law school crest printed in dark blue at the top left corner, formal enough to make Naomi pause before opening it. She stood in the apartment kitchen with one hand still resting on the mailbox key, the late afternoon sun cutting through the blinds in narrow gold bars across the table, warming the stack of unopened grocery coupons, and the ceramic bowl where her mother kept loose change. For a second, Naomi only looked at the envelope, tracing the raised edge of the return address with her thumb, as if the texture itself might tell her whether the paper inside held permission or disappointment. Lorraine was in the living room listening to a public radio program, turned down low, but she went quiet the moment she heard the mailbox key hit the counter. "Well?" she called without getting up. Naomi let out a breath that sounded steadier than she felt and slid a butter knife under the flap. The letter unfolded with a crisp whisper. She read the first line once, then again, as if the words needed time to become believable in her own house. Congratulations. It was not a full scholarship. It was not rescue descending from the heavens in polished admissions language, but it was acceptance into the evening program at Georgia State College of Law, along with a partial public interest grant that covered enough to move the impossible into the category of brutally difficult. Naomi lowered the page and stared at the refrigerator door because it was easier than crying directly at. Good news. Lorraine was already in the doorway by then, one hand on the frame, reading Naomi's face the way she always had. "You got in," she said softly. Naomi nodded once. "I got in." Lorraine closed her eyes for a brief second, and when she opened them again, they were bright with the kind of pride that made the room feel fuller than its square footage. She did not make a speech. She crossed the kitchen, put both hands on Naomi's shoulders, and kissed her forehead like she had when Naomi was 10 and feverish and pretending she was not scared. "Then the rest is logistics," she said, because that was her gift, turning miracles into work before fear could steal them. Logistics turned out to be exactly as heavy as Naomi had expected. The following months became a life measured in half hours. She kept her job at the housing nonprofit, which meant mornings began before 6 and most nights ended with legal readings spread across the kitchen table under the same yellow light that had seen her bills, her doubts, and her first outlines of escape. She learned which buses ran late after 9, which coffee shops let students sit without buying a second drink, which professors tolerated exhaustion if it was paired with preparation. The law building itself smelled like old paper, floor polish, and stress. Its hallways carried the constant shuffle of ambition, leather soles on tile, laptops snapping shut, nervous laughter outside classroom doors. Naomi arrived each evening in work clothes and changed in the restroom before class, smoothing the wrinkles from her blouse with damp paper towels if she had to, pressing her fingertips under her eyes once before stepping into rooms where students half her age debated doctrine with the confidence of people who had never had to calculate whether one more textbook meant one less prescription refill. Some classmates were kind in the easy, thoughtless way of people raised to expect institutions to welcome them. Others were colder, not openly hostile, just puzzled by her presence, by her age, by her seriousness, by the fact that she left campus immediately after class instead of lingering over drinks and networking events. One night in civil procedure, a blonde student named Trevor leaned back in his chair and said, "I do not know how you do all this after working all day. I would literally pass away." The room laughed lightly, and Naomi smiled because the comment was meant as admiration, but it still carried that familiar undertone, the idea that her effort was unusual enough to be observed before it was respected. She took notes anyway. She read cases on standing, jurisdiction, equitable relief, and due process while the train rattled beneath the city. She briefed opinions at her mother's doctor appointments. She learned to cook meals that could stretch 3 nights and still taste like care. Some evenings she fell asleep over a casebook and woke with a paragraph printed faintly across her cheek. On the worst nights the old question returned, quiet and corrosive. What if he was right to dismiss you? What if all this studying only teaches you the language of doors that still will not open? But then there were moments that answered back before fear could settle. The first time a professor called on Naomi and listened all the way through her analysis without interruption. The first time her legal writing instructor circled one of her arguments and wrote, precise and persuasive. The first time a clinic supervisor trusted her to speak with a tenant facing unlawful eviction, and Naomi watched the woman's shoulders loosen simply because somebody in a legal setting had finally spoken to her like she mattered. Those moments were not loud. They did not erase the fatigue or the money problems or the ache in Naomi's lower back after 12-hour days. But they accumulated. They formed proof. One rainy Thursday near the end of her first year, Naomi stayed late in the library finishing a memo while most of the building emptied around her. The reading lamps cast little islands of gold across the long wooden tables, and the windows reflected the dark campus back into itself. She flexed her hand, capped her pen, and looked up at the rows of books rising around her. All that law, all that authority bound in cloth and leather and numbers. Years earlier she had sat in a hearing room, asking for permission to be heard. Now she was inside the machinery itself, learning its grammar, tracing its pressure points, understanding not only how power spoke, but how it could be answered. She gathered her notes, slid them into her worn tote bag, and turned off the lamp at her table. In the darkened reflection of the window, she could see her own outline, tired but upright, and for the first time the future did not feel like a distant country. It felt like something she was already walking toward, one exhausted, disciplined, necessary night at a time. By the middle of her second year, Naomi had learned that exhaustion could become so familiar it almost felt like a roommate. It sat with her on the first bus before sunrise, followed her into the nonprofit office where the copier always jammed on days they were already behind, waited beside her in evening lectures under fluorescent lights, and came home with her after 10 o'clock to the apartment where casebooks, highlighters, and unpaid bills shared table space like uneasy relatives. Yet somewhere inside that grind, something in her had become steadier. She no longer entered classrooms feeling like an apology. She entered with outlines prepared, cases marked, questions sharpened. Professors began to notice not only that she was present, but that when she spoke, she had done the work. In constitutional law, Professor Ellen Markham, a woman with silver hair and a habit of pinching the bridge of her nose before asking hard questions, called on Naomi 3 times in 1 week. The first time Naomi answered carefully, expecting interruption. The second time she answered more directly. By the third time, she heard her own voice land in the room with a different weight, not louder, not performed, simply trusted. After class, as students packed laptops into leather bags and hurried toward the parking deck, Professor Markham stopped Naomi near the lectern and held out a marked paper. "Your brief was the strongest in the section," she said. "You do not waste words, and you do not hide behind them either." Naomi took the paper with both hands. The comment was written in blue ink along the margin, precise and unadorned, and for the rest of that week, she carried the page in her folder like a small private light. At the clinic, that light became useful. Naomi had been assigned to help with housing and administrative hearings, work that many students quietly considered less glamorous than corporate internships or appellate research. Naomi did not. She recognized the stakes too quickly. Rent notices, benefit denials, code enforcement citations, utility shut-off disputes. These were not academic exercises to her. They were the vocabulary of ordinary instability. One Thursday evening, a client named Mrs. Janice Bell came into the clinic wearing a raincoat that still dripped onto the linoleum, clutching a plastic grocery bag filled with documents. She was 68, soft-spoken, and so embarrassed about the disorder of her papers that she apologized 3 times before sitting down. Her landlord had posted notices she did not understand and raised her rent after months of unresolved plumbing issues. Another student might have treated the meeting as intake. Naomi treated it as dignity. She spread the papers across the table, smoothed each page flat, and asked questions in a voice that left room for memory. When Mrs. Bell lost track of dates and doubled back in the story, Naomi did not rush her. She listened. She wrote down every detail. She noticed the water stain on one lease addendum, the late fee assessed on a day the office had been closed, the unsigned maintenance acknowledgement buried halfway down the stack. By the end of the hour, Mrs. Bell's shoulders had dropped half an inch. "You really think this matters?" she asked, touching one of the papers with the back of her fingers as though expecting it to vanish. Naomi looked at her across the clinic desk, the fluorescent light flattening everything except truth. "Yes," she said, "and I am going to make sure somebody else has to see that too." The next week, Naomi appeared with the clinic supervisor at an administrative hearing in a squat county building with beige walls and a metal detector by the entrance. The hearing room itself was unimpressive, just laminate tables, a state seal on the wall, and air conditioning set too high, but Naomi felt the old current run through her the moment she stepped inside. Rooms like this had once belonged entirely to other people in her imagination. Now she understood their rituals, their timing, their pressure points. When the landlord's representative tried to dismiss Mrs. Bell as confused, Naomi slid the documents forward in chronological order, each one tabbed, highlighted, and cross-referenced. She did not grandstand. She did not imitate confidence. She did not feel. She simply knew her file better than the man across the table knew his assumptions. On the bus ride home that evening, with her tote bag heavy against her knee and the city lights slipping by in amber streaks beyond the glass, Naomi thought again of the hearing room from years earlier. The contrast no longer lived inside her as pure injury. It had become instruction. Back then, she had believed the deepest humiliation was being refused the chance to speak. Now she was beginning to understand something more useful. The deeper humiliation was what powerful people assumed would happen after that she would absorb the insult, adjust her expectations downward, and quietly remain who they thought she was. Instead, she had built a life around refusing that script line by line, page by page, case by case. That same spring, Richard Whitmore's name began surfacing in the news more often than usual. Not in scandal yet, not openly, but in the careful language of business reporting that hinted at strain while still flattering wealth. Delays on a waterfront project. Questions about campaign donations. A zoning appeal challenged in court. Naomi saw his photograph in the newspaper one morning at a diner counter while waiting for coffee to go, his smile still polished, his suit still immaculate, his face older but unchanged in the way some men age into power instead of out of it. She stared at the image for only a second before folding the paper shut and taking her cup back to the street. The sight of him no longer made her pulse jump the way it once had. It did something subtler. It reminded her that men like Richard Whitmore depended on a certain weather around them, a climate of deference, access, and people too intimidated or too tired to push all the way through. But weather changed. Systems shifted. Files accumulated. Records lasted. By the end of that semester, Naomi finished near the top of her class and earned an offer for a summer clerkship with the district attorney's office, a position known for long hours, hard cases, and a brutal selection process. When she read the email on a public library computer during lunch, the fluorescent screen reflected her face back at her in ghostly outline. She read the message twice, then a third time, and let the reality arrive slowly. The library around her remained perfectly ordinary, printers humming, someone coughing in the history aisle, a child asking for help with a math worksheet at the front desk. But inside Naomi something held still in a new way. Not because she had arrived. She knew better than that. But because the road ahead, once imagined only in fragments, was beginning to answer her with something concrete. She logged off the computer, slipped the printed email into her folder, and walked back out into the Georgia heat with the sensation that the future was no longer merely opening. It was recognizing her. The district attorney's office occupied 3 floors of a concrete government building that looked plain from the outside and relentless on the inside. The elevators were always too slow, the coffee was always burnt, and the hallways carried the mixed scent of paper, floor wax, and people moving with purpose before sunrise. Naomi arrived on her first day in a navy suit bought on clearance and hemmed by hand at her kitchen table, her clerk badge clipped carefully to her jacket, her hair pinned back, her legal pad fresh and waiting in her tote bag. Around her, the office was already in motion. Phones rang in short urgent bursts. Paralegals wheeled bankers' boxes stacked with files. Assistants balanced folders, coffee cups, and conversations without spilling any of them. Nobody had time for ceremony, which suited Naomi just fine. She had never trusted places that performed welcome better than they practiced fairness. Her supervising attorney, Daniel Mercer, met her outside a cramped office with one hand full of redacted reports and the other holding a paper cup that had gone lukewarm. He was in his mid-40s, rumpled in a way that suggested intelligence rather than carelessness, and his tie looked as though it had been tied correctly at 6 in the morning and argued with by noon. "Carter," he asked. Naomi nodded. He handed her a file thick enough to have weight all by itself. "Good. Read fast, write clearly, and do not confuse confidence with accuracy. Half the building already does that for free." Then he turned and kept walking, assuming she would follow. Naomi did. By the end of the first week, she understood why the office had the reputation it did. Everything moved quickly and nothing important arrived neatly. Facts came in incomplete. Witnesses changed their stories under pressure. Deadlines landed on top of each other like weather fronts. The clerks who lasted were not the loudest or the smoothest. They were the ones who could find the clean line inside a mess and hold on to it, while everyone else was reacting. Naomi discovered, to her own quiet satisfaction, that she was good at exactly that. She read every file as if someone's future sat hidden inside the footnotes. She noticed dates that did not align, statements that shifted one adjective at a time, financial disclosures that looked routine until viewed side by side. She wrote memos with the same precision she had once brought to rent ledgers and environmental maps, and soon attorneys began stopping by Daniel Mercer's doorway to ask, "Is your clerk the one who caught that discrepancy in the intake timeline?" The first time Mercer answered yes. He did not look up from the papers in front of him. "She catches what people miss because she is not in love with her own assumptions," he said. Naomi heard it from the copy room and carried the sentence with her for days. Not every lesson in the office came dressed as praise. Some came with sharper edges. During a strategy meeting on a fraud matter involving city procurement contracts, Naomi offered a question about a sequence of payments that did not fit the narrative being built around a politically connected businessman. The room went still for half a second, not because the point lacked merit, but because it had come from the youngest black woman at the table. A senior prosecutor named Alan Pierce glanced at her notes, then at her, and said, "We are not here to rewrite the whole theory because a summer clerk found a wrinkle." His tone was light enough to pass for professionalism if someone wanted it to. Naomi recognized that kind of tone too well. It did not humiliate through volume. It humiliated by assuming the room would help it. She felt the old heat rise at the back of her neck, the memory of another polished room, another man deciding in real time how seriously her mind should be taken. But Daniel Mercer set down his pen and said, without changing his expression, "Sometimes wrinkles are where the truth is hiding, Alan." Let her finish. It was a simple sentence. No speech. No drama. Yet Naomi felt its force all the way to her fingertips. She finished her analysis calmly, citing dates, transfer patterns, and one vendor relationship that had been mislabeled as incidental when it was probably central. By the end of the meeting, the room had shifted. Not completely. Institutions never. shifted completely in one afternoon. But enough. Enough for people to ask for her source documents. Enough for Alan Pierce to stop using the word wrinkle. Enough for Naomi to feel the strange private relief of being defended not because anyone pitied her, but because the work itself had earned protection. That summer the city pressed under a blanket of heat thick enough to make courthouse steps shimmer by 10 in the morning. Naomi spent long days drafting research, observing hearings, and learning that authority inside the justice system looked very different up close than it had from the outside. Some judges ruled with patience that made the room better. Others ruled like they were late for lunch. Some attorneys treated every person who walked in as a citizen. Others treated them like interruptions with case numbers. Naomi watched all of it. She listened to cadence, timing, restraint. She learned when a question was truly for information and when it was only a polished form of dismissal. She learned that the law was full of people who mistook control for wisdom, and she learned not to confuse the title in front of a name with the quality of the person carrying it. Late one evening, after most of the staff had gone home and the city outside had softened into orange streetlight and dark windows, Naomi stayed behind to organize exhibits for a white-collar matter involving development incentives and campaign contributions. The file names meant little at first. Shell companies, tax abatements, zoning waivers, public-private partnerships. Then one page stopped her. Whitmore Urban Holdings. Naomi looked at the line once, then again, feeling no dramatic jolt, only a slow tightening in her chest, the way a storm first announces itself by changing the pressure in the air. She kept reading. Subsidiaries. Donation records. Internal correspondence obtained through subpoena. A set of transactions routed through consulting firms with names bland enough to sound harmless. She turned another page and there it was. Not just his company now, but his full name in black print at the top of a memorandum discussing influence, approvals, and favors dressed in legal language. Richard Whitmore. The office around her was almost silent, only the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant whir of a cleaning cart beyond the hallway. Naomi sat very still with the page in her hand. Years had passed since the hearing room. She was older now, sharper, less easily wounded by polished contempt. But memory does not need permission to return. She could still see him leaning back in that expensive suit, dismissing her as though relevance itself answered to his schedule. Only now his name was not floating above a glossy rendering in a boardroom presentation. It was sitting inside an evidence file. Naomi lowered the page to the desk and pressed her palm flat against the cool surface beside it. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. The moment felt too serious for either. Instead, she understood, with a clarity so calm it almost frightened her, that power always sounds permanent when you are standing beneath it. It never mentions the paperwork. It never mentions the records. It never mentions the day someone patient and prepared begins reading closely. Naomi stacked the exhibits back into order, aligned the tabs, and slipped the memorandum into its proper place. Then she shut off her desk lamp and stood for a moment in the dim office, her reflection faint in the dark window above the file cabinets. Somewhere below, traffic moved through the city in soft, distant waves. She picked up her tote bag, turned toward the elevator, and carried with her not triumph, but recognition. The future had just taken on a face she already knew. By the time Naomi graduated, the city had changed just enough to make people pretend it had changed a great deal. New glass towers reflected the same old inequalities in cleaner lines. Coffee shops replaced laundromats on some blocks and called it renewal. Campaign slogans shifted toward words like transparency and accountability, while backroom relationships merely learned better tailoring. Naomi noticed all of it during her first years as an assistant district attorney, where she built a reputation slowly, the only way reputations that last are ever built. She was not flashy in court. She did not pound tables or treat procedure like theater. She prepared. She listened longer than most people thought necessary. She wrote clean motions, asked precise questions, and carried herself with the calm discipline of someone who had learned that authority becomes strongest when it no longer needs to announce itself. Judges began trusting her. Clerks remembered her deadlines never slipped. Investigators learned that if Naomi Carter asked for one more bank record or one more subpoena return, there was a reason. In the office, younger attorneys started borrowing her outlines. Older ones who had once mistaken her quiet for uncertainty now paused when she spoke. None of it happened overnight. It happened through winters of early arrivals and summers when the courthouse air conditioning rattled so hard it swallowed half the testimony. It happened through missed family dinners, midnight drafting sessions, and weekends spent cross-referencing records while the city outside moved on to football games, weddings, and rooftop parties she never had time to attend. Lorraine used to joke that Naomi had married the law without the benefit of cake. Naomi would laugh, kiss her mother on the cheek, and head back to her files. But beneath the joke, both women knew what those years were costing and what they were buying. Then, slowly, the Whitmore investigation widened. What had once looked like scattered irregularities hardened into patterns. A zoning approval linked to donations routed through consultants. A redevelopment incentive awarded after private meetings never disclosed on official calendars. Public land transferred under valuations that shifted depending on who asked and how closely they were reading. The case moved in starts and stops because power rarely falls in a straight line. Lawyers delayed. Records arrived late. Witnesses became careful. Newspapers reported questions and scrutiny and possible exposure, the soft vocabulary institutions use when rich men are finally made to feel the weather. Naomi did not lead the case at first. She was too junior when the earliest files opened. But she stayed near it, handling related motions, tracing timelines, and becoming known inside the office as someone who could read financial language without being dazzled by it. One afternoon, Daniel Mercer, older now, with more gray in his hair and less patience for nonsense than ever, dropped a box on her desk with a grunt. "You still catch what other people miss?" he asked. Naomi looked at the label. Whitmore Holdings. Supplemental disclosures. "I try to," she said. Mercer nodded. "Good. Because this thing has layers and too many people in expensive suits are hoping we get tired before we reach the middle." Naomi spent the next several weeks inside that box. Spreadsheets, board minutes, memoranda, donation records, land use maps. Internal emails stripped of their original warmth and left to stand in plain black text. The deeper she read, the clearer the shape became. Richard Whitmore had not simply benefited from a permissive culture. He had helped design one. Not through obvious villainy. Men like him were usually too polished for that. They preferred euphemism, deniability, and the kind of favor trading that could be described at lunch as strategy. Yet the documents had a rhythm to them, and once Naomi heard it, she could not unhear it. Pressure applied before votes. Incentives promised after approvals. Public harm translated into private opportunity. She moved through the file the way she once moved through housing reports and lease records, patient enough to let contradiction reveal itself. Some nights, after the office had emptied and the fluorescent lights hummed above rows of abandoned desks, she would lean back in her chair and stare at the city through the darkened window, seeing the skyline not as architecture, but as evidence. Somewhere inside those buildings were people still living downstream from decisions that had made someone else rich. Somewhere in those neighborhoods were families who had never learned the names of the people who turned their blocks into leverage. Naomi thought of the hearing room less often now, but when it returned with altered meaning. It was no longer the central wound of her life. Time and work had done what both usually do at their best. They had reduced one man from myth to proportion. Richard Whitmore was not the force that shaped her. He was merely one of the men who assumed he could. The investigation eventually led to charges, then motions, then a long procedural fight that drew cameras to courthouse steps and reporters to the lobby. Whitmore's face started appearing on evening broadcasts with none of the glow it once carried in business magazines. He still wore excellent suits. He still entered buildings like he expected doors to widen for him. But the smile had changed. It now carried strain at the edges, the first visible signs of a man discovering that influence and immunity are not the same thing. By then, Naomi had moved out of the district attorney's office and into the judiciary track, first through a clerkship, then a magistrate appointment, then years of rulings that earned notice for their clarity and fairness. She became known for something rarer than brilliance and more durable than charm. She was known for discipline. She read everything. She treated everyone in her courtroom with measured respect. She did not grandstand from the bench. She did not allow status to substitute for substance. Attorneys who entered casually learned quickly that she had no interest in being impressed by billing rates, family names, or polished indignation. What mattered in her courtroom was the record. What mattered was whether the facts could survive daylight. The day her nomination to the Superior Court was announced, Lorraine sat in the front row of the ceremony in a blue suit and a church hat she had saved for important occasions, her hands folded in her lap, and her chin lifted with that same disciplined pride Naomi had first seen at the kitchen table years earlier. After the swearing-in, people crowded forward with flowers, handshakes, and the bright language of accomplishment. Naomi accepted it all graciously, but when the room finally thinned, she found a quiet corner near a side window and let herself breathe. Outside, the courthouse lawn shimmered in late afternoon heat. Inside, the fabric of her robe settled across her shoulders with unexpected weight, not heavy in a burdensome way, but real, like history laid gently where ambition once was. She thought of microphones denied, bus rides taken in wet shoes, outlines studied under tired lamps, her mother's hand over hers on the kitchen table. None of those moments had looked powerful while they were happening. Yet all of them were here now, stitched invisibly into the seam of the robe. A few months later, her clerk entered chambers carrying a newly assigned case file and placed it beside Naomi's morning calendar. High-profile matter, the clerk said. A lot of press interest already. Naomi glanced down at the caption and felt the room become very still around a single familiar name. The State versus Richard Whitmore. For a second, she did not move. Sunlight from the tall window fell across the edge of the folder, bright against the polished wood of her desk. Somewhere outside chambers a phone rang and was answered. The radiator gave a small metallic click, although it was not cold. Naomi rested her fingertips on the file without opening it yet. Years earlier he had looked at her and seen someone he could dismiss before she finished a sentence. Now his name had arrived in her courtroom in 12-point type, carried by process, assigned by law, stripped of all ceremony except the one truth institutions are capable of when they finally work as intended. Naomi lifted the folder, opened it, and began to read. The first morning of the hearings, the courthouse steps were crowded before 8 o'clock with reporters, camera crews, and the discreet tension of people who made their living around public fallout. Black SUVs lined the curb. Microphones with station logos clustered like bright little flags in the damp spring air. Inside, security moved everyone through the metal detectors with the weary efficiency reserved for days when the building expected trouble but hoped for decorum. Naomi entered through the judicial corridor, robe folded over one arm until she reached chambers, her coffee cooling untouched on a side table while her clerk reviewed the morning calendar in a voice kept deliberately even. Motion schedule. Media overflow arrangements. Seating limits. Defense counsel requests. Naomi listened, signed what needed signing, and read through the final stack of briefing notes with the same measured attention she gave every matter, though nothing about this morning was ordinary, and pretending otherwise would have insulted the truth. The file had already confirmed that recusal was not required. No formal conflict. No direct personal connection in the legal sense. The incident from years ago existed nowhere in the record except memory, and memory alone did not excuse a judge from the duty to sit when the law assigned the case. So Naomi prepared the only way she knew how. Thoroughly. She reviewed every motion, every procedural objection, every anticipated argument from both sides until the emotional weather inside her had no room left to mislead the work. When she finally stepped into the courtroom, the room rose all at once with the rustle of expensive fabric, legal pads, camera sketches, and chairs pushing back in uneven rhythm. The air carried the dry smell of paper, polished wood, and too many people trying to appear calmer than they were. Sunlight from the high windows laid pale rectangles across the gallery floor, catching the brass railings and the silver threads in the flag to her left. Naomi took her seat, settled the robe across her shoulders, and looked out at the room with the stillness years had taught her to inhabit rather than perform. Then she saw him. Richard Whitmore sat at the defense table between two attorneys whose billing rates probably exceeded the annual salary of the people his projects had displaced without ever learning their names. Age had refined him, but not softened him. His hair was thinner at the temples now, the gray more deliberate than accidental, his jaw set with the effort of a man trying to hold posture where certainty used to be enough. The suit was immaculate, charcoal with a muted tie, the kind of restraint wealth adopts when it wants to look unfairly accused. But none of that was what held Naomi's attention for the first half-second. It was his eyes. He looked up as she entered with the reflex of every defendant forced to take stock of the bench, and in that instant recognition moved across his face before he could fully prevent it. It was small. Most of the room would have missed it. A pause too brief to name. A stiffness at the corners of the mouth. A flicker that belonged not to law, but to memory. Naomi felt it too, the old hearing room opening for one silent beat inside the present. Glass walls. Blue presentation screen. Her own hand on a microphone. His voice crossing the air with practiced dismissal. She had expected the memory might come. She had not expected how little power it would have now that he was sitting where he was, and she was sitting where she was. Not because she felt superior. Not because fate had arranged a theatrical revenge. The truth was quieter and more exacting than that. The law had simply brought them into a room where his opinion of her no longer mattered. "Be seated," Naomi said, and her voice landed level and clear beneath the vaulted ceiling. The courtroom obeyed. Richard Whitmore lowered himself into his chair a fraction too slowly, as if his body had not yet caught up with what his mind had understood. Naomi turned to the matter at hand. Appearances for the record. Preliminary motions. Scheduling issues. The formal language steadied the room the way rails steady stairs. Whitmore's lead counsel, Martin Hale, rose with the polished ease of a man accustomed to converting complexity into advantage. He spoke in careful phrases about procedural fairness, prejudicial media coverage, the importance of judicial restraint in a case of public sensitivity. Naomi listened without interrupting, pen poised lightly above her notes. Hale had a smooth baritone and a habit of adding one unnecessary adjective to every sentence. A style designed to sound weighty while creating as much air as substance. Naomi had seen versions of him her entire career. Men who believed enough polish could soften facts before they ever touched the floor. When Hale finished, the prosecution responded with citations, calendar concerns, and a request to maintain the current production deadlines. Naomi asked 3 questions. Not many. Never many. One about a delayed disclosure date. One about the basis for a requested extension. One about whether the defense intended to challenge authenticity or merely admissibility on a set of financial records. Hale adjusted his cuff and gave an answer that sounded complete without actually being one. Naomi let 2 beats of silence pass, then asked the question again, narrower this time. The room shifted almost imperceptibly. A reporter in the second row looked up from his notebook. One of the junior associates at the defense table stopped typing. Hale tried again, this time with more caution. Naomi wrote something in the margin of her legal pad and moved on. She did not need to embarrass him. Precision was enough. Through it all, Whitmore sat mostly still, though she noticed the small tells that powerful people often forgot were visible once they were denied control of the pace. The tightening at the jaw, the thumb rubbing once against the edge of a document, the glance toward counsel before certain answers, not to seek wisdom, but reassurance. Years earlier he had silenced her with the confidence of a man who expected rooms to align themselves around him. Now he was learning the opposite discipline, that in some rooms the wisest thing a person can do is wait and listen because the structure itself no longer belongs to him. Midway through the hearing, defense counsel requested permission for Mr. Whitmore to address what they called a narrow issue of reputational harm connected to pretrial publicity. It was not an outrageous request, but it was strategically transparent. An attempt to humanize him, to place his own voice into the room early, to remind everyone that charisma had once served him better than documentation. Hale framed it delicately. Your Honor, my client would appreciate the opportunity to briefly clarify. Naomi looked down at the motion, then up again. The courtroom was quiet enough that the turning of one page near the back sounded louder than it should have. She could feel the old irony standing at the edge of the moment, tempting her towards something personal, something satisfying, something less than the job. She did not take the bait. Counsel, she said, if there is a legal basis for your request, you may state it. If not, the court will proceed on the record already before it. Hale hesitated. Just once. Whitmore's expression did not change, but Naomi saw the impact land anyway. Not as humiliation, not publicly, but as a fact he could not argue with. In this room, procedure would speak before personality. Hale cleared his throat. No further basis at this time, Your Honor. Naomi nodded. Then we will proceed. It was a small ruling. Ordinary, almost. Yet Naomi felt the courtroom settle around it in a new way. Not because anyone there knew the history carried silently between the bench and the defense table, but because fairness, when applied without fear, has its own unmistakable sound. It sounds like a room realizing that influence will not be allowed to improvise the rules today. By the time the hearing adjourned, sunlight had shifted higher on the wall, and the reporters in the gallery were already half rising, eager to race whatever fragments they could turn into narrative. Naomi gathered her notes, announced the next date, and stood. The room rose with her. For one brief instant, as she turned to leave the bench, her eyes met Whitmore's again. There was no triumph in her face, and none in his. Only recognition stripped of its former imbalance. Years earlier he had looked at her and seen someone he could keep from speaking. Now he was beginning to understand the harder truth. She had not spent all those years trying to become louder than him. She had become the kind of person the law trusted to decide when anyone in the room got to speak at all. On the third day of testimony, the courtroom felt different before anyone said a word. It was not louder. If anything, it had grown more careful. The first rush of spectacle had worn off, and what remained was the slower gravity of facts accumulating where no amount of money could easily thin them out. The gallery was still full, though now it held fewer curiosity seekers and more people who understood what records, timelines, and sworn statements could do once they began speaking. To one another, Naomi could feel that shift from the bench the way a person feels weather changing before the sky fully admits it. The wood beneath her hands was smooth and cool. The overhead lights cast the same steady brightness across counsel tables, witness stand, and jury box, flattening glamour, sharpening detail. Richard Whitmore sat in the same tailored restraint he had worn all week, but the edges were beginning to show. It was not dramatic. Men like him were too practiced for dramatic collapse. It showed in smaller ways. A glass of water touched, but not emptied. A page turned twice. The faint set of the mouth when a witness answered more directly than his team had hoped. Naomi had seen defendants of every kind during her years on the bench. Some became reckless when pressure rose. Others shrank. Whitmore was doing something more familiar to power. He was trying to preserve the version of himself that had always worked in rooms built around deference, even as the room in front of him refused to cooperate. That morning the prosecution called a mid-level planning analyst from the city, a woman named Elena Ruiz who looked as though she would have preferred anywhere on earth to the witness stand. She was in her early 30s, with a navy cardigan buttoned too high and a file folder clutched so tightly the corners bent under her fingers. When she took the oath, her voice nearly disappeared on the final word. Defense counsel noticed it too. Naomi saw Martin Hale angle slightly in his chair, the way lawyers do when they sense a witness might be made smaller with sufficient pressure. Elena began carefully, describing internal review meetings, document circulation, valuation adjustments, and the sequence by which certain recommendations moved faster than others once Whitmore's interests became involved. She had facts, but she did not wear authority comfortably, and every sentence arrived as though she had first asked permission from the air. Halfway through direct examination, she hesitated over a date and looked down at the papers in front of her. It was no more than a brief pause, but Hale rose almost immediately on cross with the smooth alertness of a man who believed uncertainty in a woman's voice was an opening rather than a human fact. "Ms. Ruiz," he said, strolling one measured step from the podium, "you would agree, would you not, that you were never a decision-maker in these meetings?" Elena swallowed. "I prepared the documentation and analysis." "Exactly," Hale said with a courteous smile sharpened at the edges. "Documentation. You were present, but not empowered to determine outcomes." Naomi watched Elena's shoulders draw in a fraction. She knew that movement. She had lived inside it once. The body's old instinct to become smaller when a polished room begins teaching you how little your place in it is supposed to count. Hale continued in that same clean tone, laying out titles, hierarchies, and reporting structures as though he were merely clarifying facts rather than arranging a person back into the lower rung where her testimony could be easier to dismiss. Naomi let him go only as far as fairness required. Then Elena reached for a document, her fingers slipping once at the edge, and Hale said, "Take your time," with a gentleness so performative it landed almost as insult. The courtroom held still. Naomi looked at the witness. Elena's breathing had become shallow enough to see from the bench. The prosecutor started to rise, then thought better of interrupting. In the silence that followed, memory brushed against Naomi so sharply it felt almost physical. A microphone. A hearing room. A man deciding her lack of institutional rank made her words optional. The old ache was there for one instant. Not fresh anymore, but exact. Naomi did not indulge it. She turned it into clarity. "Ms. Ruiz," she said, and the witness looked up immediately, startled by the steadiness in Naomi's voice. "You may answer in your own time." It was a simple sentence. 8 words. No thunder, no rebuke, no theater for the press benches. Yet the effect moved through the room with quiet force. Elena's hands stilled on the folder. The prosecutor sat back. Even Hale paused, his expression resetting by a degree too small for anyone but the practiced to notice. Naomi had not corrected him harshly because harshness was unnecessary. She had done something harder and more important. She had restored the conditions under which truth could emerge without needing to borrow the manners of power first. Elena drew a breath that reached all the way down this time. Then she answered. Not perfectly, not with polished confidence, but clearly. She identified the memo she had prepared, the edits made after a private meeting. She did not attend, the valuation assumptions changed without explanation, and the pressure she later felt to treat those changes as routine. Hale objected twice, both times on grounds too thin to survive careful scrutiny. Naomi overruled the first and sustained the second in part, narrowing the testimony without damaging its center. That was what fairness required, and she gave it to both sides with the same even hand. Still, something had shifted. Once Elena realized the room would permit her to finish a sentence before deciding what kind of person she was allowed to be, the facts began arriving with greater shape. Dates aligned. Emails connected. The paper trail stopped looking abstract and started resembling human intention. Richard Whitmore did not visibly react, but Naomi noticed the smallest movement at the defense table, his fingers pressing flat against the edge of a legal pad as Elena described how expedited approvals were treated internally whenever his name appeared on a project. Not because he was being singled out unfairly, because influence always sounds normal inside the building where it is exercised. Only later, under oath, does its tone become recognizable. By the lunch recess, the gallery had lost that restless media energy and taken on something quieter, almost reverent. Reporters were still writing, but now they were writing less like scavengers and more like stenographers to consequence. Elena stepped down from the witness stand looking exhausted and faintly disbelieving, as though she had expected the room to reject her halfway through and was not yet sure what to do with the fact that it had not. As the bailiff called recess, she glanced once toward the bench, not long enough to invite attention, just long enough for gratitude to pass without becoming spectacle. Naomi gave no visible response because the bench is not the place for private exchange. But inside, she felt the moment settle. Years earlier, someone with power had refused to let her voice matter. She had spent half a life learning the law not so she could humiliate him when the balance reversed, but so she could become the kind of person who never confused another human being's lack of status with lack of relevance. When the courtroom emptied for lunch and the sound of shoes and whispers faded into the corridor, Naomi remained on the bench a second longer than usual, her notes aligned beneath her hand, the seal of the court steady on the wall above. In that stillness, she understood with unusual calm that redemption does not always look like winning. Sometimes it looks like refusing to become the very thing that once tried to shrink you. By the final week of proceedings, the courtroom no longer belonged to anticipation. Anticipation had burned off days earlier, replaced by that heavier and more difficult thing that arrives when the facts stop circling and begin to land. Exhibits had been marked, objections argued, timelines built in clean black ink across easels that now stood like plain-spoken monuments to patience. Emails once buried in folders had been read aloud in measured voices. Donation records had met calendar entries. Valuation reports had met internal edits. The whole case had acquired the shape that only sustained scrutiny can give, and with that shape came a strange kind of quiet. Even the reporters seemed to understand that the most important moments were no longer the flashy ones. They were the small procedural turns where evasion failed and the record held. Naomi felt that quiet from the bench like the steady pull of current beneath water. It was there in the way attorneys rose more carefully now, in the reduced swagger at the defense table, in the gallery's habit of leaning forward not for drama but for detail. Richard Whitmore still arrived in tailored suits and well-shined shoes, but by then the performance of control had thinned. He sat straighter than comfort allowed, spoke to counsel in low-clipped exchanges, and watched witnesses with the alert stillness of a man beginning to realize that intelligence and influence were not the same as immunity. On that morning, the defense made what everyone in the room understood would be one of its final meaningful attempts to change the emotional weather. Martin Hale rose and requested leave for his client to make a brief statement regarding intent, public service, and what he called the broader civic context of Mr. Whitmore's business decisions. The wording was elegant. It was meant to be. It wrapped self-interest in the language of vision and tried to place charisma back at the center where documentation had steadily displaced it. Naomi listened with her hands folded lightly over the edge of the bench. Hale's voice had lost none of its polish, but polish was no longer carrying what it had. At the beginning, the prosecution objected on narrow grounds. Naomi reviewed the cited rule, then looked down at the file, then back toward counsel. In that pause she could feel the old irony again, the memory not only of being silenced years earlier, but of the entire architecture that had once made a man like Richard Whitmore believe public space itself could be sorted by whose voice deserved completion. Yet the law was not memory, and the bench was not a stage for private satisfaction. Naomi knew that more deeply than anyone in the room. The court will allow a limited statement within the boundaries of relevance already established, she said. There was a faint shift in the gallery, a murmur almost too small to name. Whitmore looked up at her then with something sharper than gratitude and more complicated than relief. Perhaps he had expected refusal and was preparing to turn it into narrative. Perhaps he had expected indulgence and was preparing to use it. What he received instead was what Naomi had spent her whole life learning to give: fairness without surrender. He stood when instructed, buttoned his jacket out of habit, then unbuttoned it again when he seemed to remember he was not in a boardroom. For a second he held the edge of the lectern with one hand and looked not at the gallery, not at the cameras sketched behind the courtroom artist's hand, but at the middle distance where rehearsed men often search for sincerity. He spoke well. Men like Richard Whitmore almost always do. He spoke of ambition, economic growth, civic investment, difficult choices made in competitive markets. He described his work as transformative, his decisions as misunderstood, his methods as imperfect perhaps, but never malicious. The language was smooth and professionally remorseful, without ever fully becoming accountable. Naomi let him speak to the exact limit aloud. Not because she believed performance should substitute for record, but because truth often reveals itself most clearly when a person is given enough room to show which words he still cannot bring himself to say. Whitmore never once said displaced families. He never said pressure. He never said influence in the plain way it had operated. He never said that certain neighborhoods had been treated as leverage because no one with power expected those residents to shape the room. Instead, he spoke of momentum, opportunity, revitalization, and regrettable perceptions. Naomi had heard all those words before in other forms, in other rooms, usually spoken over people rather than with them. When he finished, the silence that followed was different from the silence he had once imposed on her. That old silence had been about erasure. This one was about evaluation. The room had listened. Now the room was measuring. Naomi thanked counsel, clarified the legal status of the statement for the record, and moved on without commentary. She did not need to expose what everyone could already feel. The law, at its best, does not punish vanity by mocking it. It simply refuses to mistake it for substance. The afternoon brought closing arguments. The prosecution built its case the way good prosecutors do when spectacle has finally exhausted itself, piece by piece, document by document, showing how access had become expectation and expectation had become abuse. The defense answered with complexity, selective omission, and the old comforting suggestion that unclear morality should be treated as legal uncertainty. Naomi listened to both sides with the same patient stillness she had maintained from day one, though inside she could feel the years arranged behind her like witnesses of their own. The bus rides in wet shoes. The legal pad at dawn. Lorraine at the kitchen table, saying if they can decide it in one room, then you need to get into a room, where they cannot. Professor Markham's blue ink note. Daniel Mercer's tired voice, saying sometimes wrinkles are where the truth is hiding. Elena Ruiz on the stand, hands trembling until someone in authority made space for her to finish. None of those moments had promised this one, yet all of them lived in it. Late in the day, just before adjournment, one final witness was recalled to authenticate a chain of correspondence tied to a zoning variance. He was a quiet records custodian named Thomas Green, middle-aged, careful, the kind of man institutions rely on without ever celebrating. As he settled into the witness chair, defense counsel began with a mildly condescending tone, treating him less as a custodian of fact than as a procedural inconvenience. Thomas faltered once over the naming convention of archived files and glanced toward the exhibits with apologetic embarrassment. Naomi saw the room preparing, almost unconsciously, to rank him. Not important enough. Not polished enough. Not central enough. The hierarchy of relevance trying, once again, to assemble itself in real time. Mr. Green, Naomi said before counsel could seize the hesitation and turn it into atmosphere. Take the time you need. The court is listening. Thomas nodded, found the document, and authenticated the chain cleanly. The final email in that chain connected an internal commitment to a public denial so plainly that even the defense table went still. It was not thunder. It was paper. That was all. Yet paper, read at the right moment, can alter the pressure in an entire room. Naomi marked the exhibit, confirmed the record, and called adjournment for the day. As everyone rose, she gathered her notes slowly, aware of the late afternoon light stretching across the floorboards in long amber bars. Whitmore remained standing at the defense table for a second longer than required, one hand resting flat beside his file. He looked older in that light, not ruined, not broken, simply brought into proportion. When his eyes lifted to the bench, Naomi met them only briefly. There was no satisfaction in her expression and no invitation to nostalgia. The years between them had become too full for that. What passed there instead was something quieter and infinitely more difficult to earn. He understood now that she had not climbed all this way to become his opposite. She had climbed to become answerable to something higher than either of them. Naomi rose. The courtroom rose with her. And in that shared movement, under the seal of the court and the last warm light of day, the old imbalance finally disappeared without anyone needing to say its name. The morning of the ruling arrived with a clear sky over downtown Atlanta, the kind of bright, almost indifferent weather that made the courthouse steps look cleaner than the week deserved. Reporters had gathered early again, though the noise outside stayed muffled once the heavy doors closed and the stone corridors took over, turning the building back into what it had always wanted to be, a place where process mattered more than performance. Naomi entered chambers before 8, set her bag beside the desk, and stood for a moment at the window with both hands resting lightly on the sill. Far below, traffic moved in patient lines through the grid of the city, sunlight catching on windshields and glass towers, touching neighborhoods that had long felt the consequences of decisions made in rooms where they were never invited. On her desk, the ruling sat in a neat stack beside the case file, each page marked, reviewed, and revised until every sentence carried exactly the weight it could bear and no more. Naomi had slept very little, not because she doubted the law, but because she respected what a ruling could do once spoken aloud. It could not heal every harm. It could not rewind years. It could not return people to apartments already gone or trust already worn thin. But it could do what institutions are most honest doing when they choose honesty at all. It could name what the record had shown and refuse to look away. Her clerk knocked softly, entered with the morning calendar, and placed a fresh glass of water on the desk. Full gallery again, he said. Naomi nodded. Thank you. When the door closed, she picked up the ruling and read the opening paragraph one last time, not searching for drama, only for clarity. Outside chambers, footsteps passed in small quick bursts. Somewhere farther down the hall, a copier started up. The courthouse was waking into consequence. In the courtroom, everyone rose when Naomi entered, and the sound of fabric, shoes, and chairs settling again came back to her like a rhythm she had known for years. The gallery was full from front rail to back wall. Reporters sat poised with notebooks open. Attorneys held their expressions and practiced neutrality. The prosecutor's table was organized into clean stacks. Martin Hale sat with both hands folded over a yellow legal pad, his face composed but tighter than usual around the mouth. Beside him, Richard Whitmore looked toward the bench with that same controlled stillness he had worn all week, though now even the control seemed to cost him something. Naomi took her seat and looked over the room not as a stage, not as an arena, but as a collection of people bound for 1 hour by the discipline of listening. The seal of the court stood above her in carved relief, steady and unadorned. The flags on either side of the bench were still. Sunlight reached through the upper windows in long pale bands, touching the rail, the witness stand, the first row of the gallery. Naomi began. Her voice was level, neither cold nor generous, simply exact. She summarized the procedural history. The evidence admitted, the standards applied. She moved carefully through the record, line by line, the way she had learned to do in every part of her life that mattered. She named the financial transfers, the undisclosed meetings, the altered valuations, the correspondence that contradicted public representations. She did not raise her tone. She did not embellish. Truth did not need assistance now. The more plainly she spoke, the more force the facts carried on their own. As she read, the room seemed to tighten inward around the words. Reporters stopped glancing around. Even the gallery's small, restless movements faded. Naomi could hear only the measured cadence of her own voice, the occasional turn of a page, and once the quiet clink of someone setting down a pen. She did not look often at Whitmore while reading, but when she did she saw what time, scrutiny, and the loss of control had made visible. Not a villain from a cheap story. Not a monster. Something more ordinary and more dangerous than that. A man who had grown used to systems bending toward his convenience until he mistook convenience for innocence. A man who had once believed that other people's limits were part of the natural order. The ruling made no room for mythology. It reduced him to the record. That was justice in one of its plainest forms. When Naomi reached the final section, the courtroom felt so still that the central air sounded suddenly louder than before. She set out the legal findings with disciplined precision and then delivered the ruling itself. The court found that the evidence established a pattern of corrupt influence, material concealment, and unlawful manipulation of public process for private gain. Several counts were sustained. Others, more weakly supported, were not. Naomi did not grant the prosecution every argument simply because the broad narrative had held. Fairness required more backbone than that. She narrowed where the law demanded narrowing and held where the facts justified holding. In that balance lay the dignity of the entire proceeding. Whitmore's lead counsel lowered his gaze as the ruling concluded, already recalculating the next move in a mind trained to survive setback by converting it into strategy. Richard Whitmore himself remained standing very still at counsel table after Naomi instructed the parties to rise. His face did not collapse. Men like him often keep their expressions even when the world beneath them shifts. But Naomi saw the difference anyway. It was in the eyes now, where certainty had once lived unchallenged and something less stable had taken its place. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The deep late recognition that no title, no account balance, no room full of deferential people could permanently shield a person from the simple force of a record read by someone who was not afraid of him. The bailiff gave the next instruction. The clerk noted the findings. Reporters were already half rising in their seats, then catching themselves, reminded by the formality of the room that consequence had to finish unfolding before it could be translated into headlines. Naomi signed the final page with a pen that moved cleanly across the paper, then handed it down. The gesture was small, almost administrative, yet she felt its weight all the way to her wrist. Years earlier, in a different room with glass walls and cold light, Richard Whitmore had cut her off before she could complete a sentence, confident that someone like him got to decide when someone like her had become inconvenient. Now the law had done something more lasting than revenge. It had removed the question from him entirely. As the hearing closed and the formal language of adjournment settled over the room, Naomi stood. Everyone else did too. For one brief moment, while attorneys gathered papers and the gallery held its breath between history and reaction, her eyes met Whitmore's one final time. No anger passed between them. No triumph. Only the quiet fact that the world had finally required him to remain in place and listen to a woman he once considered unworthy of the floor. Naomi turned and stepped down from the bench entrance toward Chambers, the robe shifting softly around her. The murmur of the courtroom rising at last behind her like weather breaking after days of pressure. She did not walk faster. She did not look back. The ruling was done. The record would remain. And somewhere beneath all the marble, paper, and polished wood, the deepest truth of the morning settled into place with almost no sound at all. He had spent years building a world where her voice could be dismissed, and she had spent those same years becoming the kind of person whose voice the law would preserve. When Naomi stepped into Chambers and closed the door behind her, the noise of the courthouse thinned at once, as if the wood and stone themselves knew how to protect a person from the first rush of public reaction. She set the file on her desk, removed her glasses, and stood still for a moment with one hand resting against the cool surface, feeling the last hour move through her not as triumph, but as release. Outside the tall window, late afternoon light leaned gold across the city, laying a soft shine over rooftops, traffic, and the long, patient geometry of downtown streets. Atlanta looked almost gentle from that height. The same city that had once seemed too large, too polished, too full of closed doors when she was 22 and carrying borrowed confidence in a department store blazer, now spread beneath her with a calmer face. On the corner of her desk sat a framed photograph of her mother in a pale blue church dress, smiling into the sun with one hand braced on her hip, like she had no intention of apologizing for the space she took up in the world. Naomi picked up the frame with both hands and looked at it longer than usual. "It is done," she whispered, not because anyone needed to hear it, but because some sentences become real only after they pass through the air. There was a soft knock. Then her clerk opened the door just enough to lean in. "You have a few messages waiting," he said. "And there is someone downstairs asking if you might have a moment when you are able." Naomi set the photograph down. "Who is it?" "Ms. Elena Ruiz." Naomi paused, then nodded once. "Tell her I can give her 5 minutes. A few minutes later Elena entered with the same careful posture she had carried to the witness stand, though now there was less fear in it and more uncertainty, as if she still was not sure what to do with being welcomed into a room where she had once expected to be managed. She stood just inside the doorway holding a small manila envelope against her side. "I hope this is all right," she said. "I did not want to take much of your time." Naomi gestured gently toward the chair across from the desk, but Elena remained standing until Naomi sat first. Only then did she lower herself into the seat. The envelope in her hands looked worn at the corners. "I just wanted to say thank you," Elena said. Her voice was stronger than it had been on the stand, though still threaded with feeling. "Not for the ruling. I know that was the law. I mean for that day. When I froze." Naomi knew at once which moment she meant. The witness stand. The bent folder. The room preparing to decide her value before she had finished her sentence. Elena looked down at the envelope, then back up. "You let me finish," she said. "That sounds small when I say it out loud. But it was not small to me." Naomi folded her hands loosely on the desk. "No," she said softly. "It was not." Elena gave a short breath that might have become a laugh if there had not been tears so close behind it. She slid the envelope across the desk. "My father worked city maintenance for 28 years. He saved every article he ever clipped about court decisions, zoning fights, public meetings, all of it. He used to tell me that most people think power is the loudest person in the room, but real power is whoever gets written into the record. He passed 3 years ago. I found this after I was subpoenaed." Naomi opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping, old enough that the paper had gone soft at the folds. It was a local article about a scholarship banquet from years earlier, and there, halfway down the page, was a photograph of a much younger Naomi in a plain black dress, standing near a podium with her chin lifted just slightly, as if already practicing how not to bend. The article itself was not long, but one sentence had been underlined in blue ink. "She plans to study law and advocate for communities whose voices are often dismissed in public process." Naomi read the line twice. For a second the room blurred at the edges, not because of the article itself, but because she could feel the years between that young woman and the one sitting at the desk now draw close enough to touch. "He kept this?" she asked quietly. Elena nodded. "He said you looked like someone who meant what she was saying." For a moment neither of them spoke. The late light stretched farther across the floor, warming the legs of the chairs and the lower edge of the bookshelf. Down the hall, A cart rattled past and faded. Naomi set the clipping back into the envelope with extraordinary care. "Thank you for bringing it," she said, "and for standing firm when it counted." Elena shook her head gently. "I almost did not." Naomi gave her the smallest smile. Most courage arrives looking exactly like that. Elena left a minute later with her shoulders straighter than when she had entered, and when the door closed, the chambers seemed fuller rather than emptier. Naomi sat back and let the silence settle. On her desk lay the old clipping, her mother's photograph, the signed ruling, and a stack of ordinary administrative papers already waiting to remind her that history, once it happens, is quickly asked to make room for the next matter on the calendar. That was how institutions survived, not with endless ceremony, but with the discipline of continuing. At 6 o'clock she finally left the courthouse by a quieter side exit. The crowd had thinned. The cameras were gone. The marble steps held the last stored warmth of the day under the soles of her shoes. Across the street, the windows of office towers burned amber in the sinking sun. A church bell rang somewhere a few blocks away, low and unhurried. Naomi stood for a moment at the bottom of the steps, breathing in air that still held a trace of summer heat rising from the pavement. People passed without recognizing her. A man in a delivery uniform balanced 2 coffees in a cardboard tray. A woman in running shoes tugged a child by the hand toward the crosswalk before the light changed. A bus exhaled at the curb. The city went on, as cities do, carrying within it both injury and repair. Naomi turned toward the parking lot, then stopped when she noticed someone standing half a block away near the black sedan that had brought him all week. Richard Whitmore. No cameras. No lawyers at his shoulders. No polished room arranged to favor him. Just a man in an expensive suit gone slightly tired in the collar, waiting while a driver held the rear door open. He saw her then. The distance between them was too great for any private words and too public for any useful performance. For one suspended second, neither moved. Then Whitmore did something small and unmistakable. He lowered his head. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just a brief, human inclination, stripped of every room that had once taught him he did not need to make it. Naomi looked at him across the fading light and felt no desire to hold the moment over him, no need to freeze it into victory. Some reckonings do not require witnesses to be complete. She gave the slightest nod in return, then continued on. By the time she reached her car, the sky above the buildings had turned lavender at the edges, and the first evening lights were beginning to come alive in windows all across the city. She placed her bag on the passenger seat, set the envelope beside it, and before starting the engine, she rested both hands on the steering wheel and let herself breathe. All those years ago he had denied her the floor because he thought dignity could be assigned by wealth, by race, by status, by who had always been obeyed in rooms like his. But the world had not changed because he finally listened. It had changed because she never stopped becoming the woman whose calm, honest voice could outlast every door that closed on it. In the soft, darkening light, with the courthouse behind her and the city opening ahead, Naomi started the car and drove home, carrying no triumph, only peace, and that peace was deeper than anything power could ever buy.